We've all felt the sting of being left out, of standing alone while everyone else seems to belong. But for Emma Hartford, that feeling was about to become her defining moment. In the frontier town of Cedar Ridge, she arrives at a wedding celebration without an escort. A shameful thing for any young woman in 1876. The whispers start immediately, the pointing, the cruel laughter. Then a rugged mountain man named Cade Brennan steps behind her, places his hand on her shoulder, and whispers words that will change everything. "Pretend you're with me." It seems like simple kindness. But what happens next will spark a scandal that shakes the entire town and reveals a truth nobody saw coming. What was Cade Brennan really protecting that night? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cedar Ridge sat in a valley where the Montana Territory stretched wide and unforgiving, a place where the summers burned short and bright, and the winters came early with teeth that bit deep. It was 1876, and the town had grown from a trading post to a proper settlement in just under 20 years. False-fronted buildings lined Main Street, the church steeple rose white against the mountains, and everyone knew everyone else's business, sometimes before they knew it themselves. Emma Hartford lived at the edge of town in a cabin her father had built with his own hands. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms with a stone fireplace and a root cellar that kept cool even in August, but it was hers. She'd kept it these 6 years since her parents passed, one after the other, in the winter fever of 1870. She'd been 16 then, suddenly alone in a world that didn't much care for young women without family or fortune. The morning light came through the cabin's single east-facing window, touching the sewing table where Emma spent most of her days. Fabric lay in neat folds along one wall, calico and muslin, a bit of silk she was saving for something special. Her mother had taught her to sew before the fever took her, and Emma had inherited her steady hand and eye for detail. She could make a dress that fit like it had been painted on, could turn a worn coat into something a man might wear to Sunday service with pride. She made her living with that needle and thread. The women of Cedar Ridge came to her when they wanted something done right, a wedding dress, a christening gown, a winter coat that would last more than one season. They paid her fair, most of them. Mrs. Dalton, who owned the dry goods store with her husband, was particularly generous. But there was a distance in their dealings, a line Emma couldn't quite cross. She was the seamstress. She was useful. But she wasn't one of them. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, delivered by Sarah Mason herself. Sarah was marrying Thomas Pritchard, the blacksmith's son, and the whole town was invited to celebrate. Emma had held the cream-colored card in her hands, reading the careful script, feeling the weight of what it meant. An invitation, a gesture of inclusion, but also a test. "You'll come, won't you?" Sarah had asked, standing in the doorway of the cabin with genuine warmth in her eyes. Sarah was one of the few women in town who treated Emma like a person rather than a service. "It wouldn't be the same without you. You made my dress so beautiful." Emma had smiled and nodded and said, of course she'd come. But after Sarah left, she'd sat at her sewing table for a long time, holding that invitation, feeling the familiar weight of loneliness settle on her shoulders like winter snow. A wedding without an escort, a young woman alone at a celebration meant for couples and families. She knew what it would look like. She knew what people would say. The morning of the wedding, Emma woke before dawn. She couldn't afford to hire someone to walk her to the Mason ranch, couldn't ask any of the men in town without creating the wrong impression. She would go alone or not at all. And she'd already made her decision. She washed at the basin, the water cold from the pump outside. She brushed her dark hair until it shone, then pinned it up the way her mother used to wear hers, simple, elegant, with a few loose tendrils around her face. The dress she'd made for herself was a deep forest green, modest but well-fitted, with small covered buttons down the front. It was the nicest thing she owned. From a small wooden box on the shelf above her bed, Emma took out her mother's cameo brooch. The porcelain was delicate, cream-colored, with a lady's profile carved in relief. Her father had given it to her mother on their wedding day, and her mother had worn it on every special occasion after. Emma pinned it carefully at her throat, feeling the cool weight of it, feeling connected to something bigger than her loneliness. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the basin. A young woman looked back, not beautiful in the way Sarah Mason was beautiful, with her golden hair and easy laugh, but not plain either. Emma had her father's strong jaw and her mother's clear grey eyes. She looked like someone who could endure. Someone who had endured. The walk to the Mason ranch took 40 minutes. The celebration would be held outdoors, weather permitting, and the September afternoon was holding fine, warm, with a hint of the coming autumn in the breeze. Emma walked slowly, in no hurry to arrive, watching the way the light slanted through the cottonwoods along the creek. She thought about her parents. Her father had been a carpenter, skilled with his hands, patient in his work. Her mother had kept a garden that people still talked about, vegetables and flowers growing in profusion despite the short season. They'd loved each other in a quiet, steady way that Emma had taken for granted as a child. Now she understood it was rare. Now she understood what she'd lost. The road curved, and she could see other families ahead of her, walking together toward the Mason place. The Hendersons, with their 4 children. The Carlsons, the husband and wife, walking arm in arm. The young Brenner couple, married just last year, still glowing with new love. Emma slowed her pace, letting distance grow between herself and the others. Better to arrive separately than to highlight her aloneness by walking near them. In town, there'd been talk lately of a mountain man coming down to trade. Cade Brennan, they called him. He lived somewhere high in the Bitterroots, came to Cedar Ridge twice a year with pelts and game, left with supplies, and disappeared again. Emma had never seen him. She stayed away from the trading post. When the mountain men came through, they were rough characters, most of them more comfortable with wilderness than civilization. But Mrs. Dalton had mentioned him last week when Emma delivered a mended shirt. "That Brennan fellow's in town again," she'd said, folding the shirt with care. "Quiet as a stone, that one, but honest. I'll give him that. He pays fair and doesn't cause trouble." Emma had thought nothing of it at the time. Why would she? A mountain man and a seamstress had no reason to cross paths. She touched the cameo at her throat as the Mason ranch came into view. The house sat on a rise, and already she could see the gathering tables set up in the yard, lanterns hanging from posts, even though it was still daylight, fiddle music carrying on the wind. Emma Hartford took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the celebration alone. She had no idea that her life was about to change. She had no idea that a man she'd never met was about to step out of the shadows and offer her something more precious than gold. She had no idea that by the end of this night she would be the subject of gossip that would echo through Cedar Ridge for months to come. All she knew was that she was tired of standing on the outside. And if attending this wedding alone was what it took to feel like she belonged, even for one afternoon, then that's what she would do. The music grew louder as she approached. Laughter carried on the breeze. And Emma Hartford, seamstress and orphan, walked into the light. The Mason ranch spread across a gentle slope where grass grew thick and cattle grazed in the distance. The main house was sturdy timber and stone, built to last through hard winters, and today it was transformed. Tables stretched in long rows across the yard, covered in white linen that moved softly in the breeze. Lanterns hung from posts driven into the ground, their glass chimneys catching the afternoon sun. A platform had been built for dancing, and a fiddler was already playing, his bow moving quick and easy across the strings. People clustered in groups, talking and laughing. Children ran between the tables, their voices high and bright. The smell of roasting meat drifted from the cooking fires, mixing with fresh bread and apple pie. It was the kind of celebration that made a community feel like family, everyone gathered together to witness 2 lives joining into one. Emma approached slowly, her hands folded in front of her. She could feel eyes turning toward her, could sense the moment when people noticed she was alone. The conversations didn't stop exactly, but they changed. The quality of the noise shifted. Sarah Mason saw her first and came rushing over, her wedding dress flowing white and beautiful, the dress Emma had spent 3 weeks perfecting, with its lace collar and pearl buttons and hem that brushed the grass just so. Sarah's face was flushed with happiness, and she took Emma's hands in hers without hesitation. "Emma, I'm so glad you came." Sarah's joy was genuine, uncomplicated. She was 19 and in love, and nothing could touch her today. "Come, let me introduce you to Thomas's cousins. They came all the way from Bozeman." But before Sarah could lead her anywhere, Mrs. Whitmore materialized like a storm cloud. She was a tall woman, angular and severe, with iron-grey hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face. She'd lost her husband to a mining accident 5 years back, and had since appointed herself the moral guardian of Cedar Ridge. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice carrying more weight than the words should have had, "your mother needs you by the cake table. Some confusion about the cutting." It wasn't true. Emma could see Mrs. Mason across the yard, calmly talking with guests, nowhere near the cake table. But Sarah, eager and distracted by her wedding day, squeezed Emma's hands and hurried off. Mrs. Whitmore turned to Emma with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Miss Hartford, how brave of you to come." The word brave sounded like an insult. "Thank you for having me," Emma said quietly, though she knew Mrs. Whitmore had nothing to do with the invitation. "Yes, well." Mrs. Whitmore's gaze travelled over Emma's dress, the cameo at her throat, her carefully pinned hair. Finding nothing to criticize in her appearance seemed to disappoint the woman. "I suppose you'll want to find a seat, perhaps near the back. The family tables are rather full." Other women had gathered now, forming a loose circle. Emma recognized them all: Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Carlson, Betty Brenner with her new marriage glow already fading into the reality of frontier life. They weren't cruel women, not really, but they were comfortable, settled in their places, and Emma's presence alone was an uncomfortable reminder that not everyone had a place. "I heard she came all by herself," Mrs. Henderson whispered, not quite quietly enough. "No escort at all." "It's not proper," Betty Brenner added, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone who'd recently joined the ranks of respectability and was determined to enforce its rules. A young, unmarried woman at a wedding celebration without a chaperone or companion. What will people think? Emma felt heat rise in her face. She wanted to say that she'd been invited, that Sarah wanted her here, that she had every right to celebrate with the community she'd lived among for 6 years. But the words stuck in her throat, heavy and useless. "Perhaps she's hoping to catch someone's eye," Mrs. Whitmore said, and the other women made small, shocked sounds that weren't shocked at all. "Though I can't imagine who'd be interested in—" "That's enough." The voice came from behind Emma, low and rough, like stones tumbling in a creek bed. She turned and found herself looking at a chest, a broad chest covered in a worn flannel shirt that had been mended more than once. She looked up, and finally found a face. He was tall, this man, taller than most men she'd seen. His face was weathered from sun and wind, carved into hard planes and angles that spoke of a life spent outdoors. His hair was dark, streaked with grey at the temples, and long enough to touch his collar. His eyes were what caught her pale blue, like ice on a lake, but not cold at all. He wore leather gloves, worn smooth from work, and his clothes were clean but patched. A mountain man. It had to be. No one else looked quite like this, half wild and wholly self-sufficient. Cade Brennan didn't look at Emma. He looked at Mrs. Whitmore, and something in his gaze made the older woman take a step back. "These ladies were just—" Mrs. Whitmore began, but Cade raised one hand slightly and she fell silent. Then he turned to Emma. and the hardness in his face softened just a fraction. He moved around her, slowly, deliberately, until he stood slightly behind her and to her right. Then he did something that would be talked about in Cedar Ridge for months to come. He placed his hand on Emma's shoulder. The touch was gentle but firm, and Emma could feel the warmth of it through the fabric of her dress. Her breath caught. The yard seemed to go quiet, though the fiddle still played and children still ran and laughed. Cade Brennan leaned down just slightly and spoke close to Emma's ear. His voice was for her alone. "Pretend you're with me. Nobody will bother you." Emma's mind went blank. She stood frozen, feeling the weight of his hand, aware of every eye on them, unable to process what was happening. Mrs. Whitmore's mouth had fallen open. Mrs. Henderson clutched her husband's arm. Betty Brenner looked like she might faint. Cade straightened, his hand still on Emma's shoulder, and looked at the gathered women with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but held a challenge in it. "Ladies," he said, nodding once. Then to Emma, "Shall we find seats?" He offered his arm, and Emma, moving in a kind of dream, took it. His arm was solid beneath her hand, real and steady. They walked together across the yard, and the crowd parted before them like water around a stone. Emma could feel the weight of 100 stares. She could hear the whispers starting, racing from group to group faster than the wind. Cade Brennan, the mountain man who spoke to no one, who came to town twice a year and disappeared into the wilderness, had just publicly claimed this young seamstress as his companion. He led her to a table near the center of the yard, not in back where Mrs. Whitmore had suggested, and pulled out a chair for her. Emma sat, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Cade settled beside her, his presence like a wall between her and the judgment she could feel radiating from every direction. "You didn't have to do that," Emma whispered, finding her voice at last. Cade looked at her with those pale eyes. Up close, she could see the lines around them, the marks of years spent squinting against mountain sun and snow. "Yes," he said simply, "I did. But they'll talk. They're already talking. Let them talk." He said it like it was the simplest thing in the world, like the opinions of an entire town weighed nothing against his decision. Emma wanted to ask why. Why would a stranger intervene like this? Why would he subject himself to gossip and speculation for someone he didn't even know? But before she could form the questions, Sarah appeared again, her face bright with curiosity and something that looked like approval. "Mr. Brennan, how wonderful that you could join us. And with Emma, oh, I'm so pleased." Sarah seemed to mean it, seemed genuinely delighted by this unexpected pairing. Cade nodded at her. "Congratulations on your marriage, Miss Mason." "Mrs. Pritchard now," Sarah corrected with a laugh. "Thank you. Please, both of you, enjoy the celebration. Emma, I'll want to hear everything later." She swept away to greet other guests, leaving Emma and Cade in a bubble of awkward silence. Around them, the celebration continued, but Emma was intensely aware that she and Cade were the real entertainment now. "I don't even know you," Emma said finally, looking down at her hands. "No," Cade agreed. "You don't. Then why?" "Because nobody should have to stand alone when they don't want to," he said. And there was something in his voice, a depth of understanding, a recognition of loneliness that made Emma's throat tight. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not just the rough exterior but something beneath. Kindness, strength, and a loneliness that maybe matched her own. "Thank you," she whispered. Cade's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "You're welcome." The fiddle music swelled, and people began to move toward the dancing platform. Emma sat beside this stranger who'd appointed himself her protector, feeling the cameo brooch heavy at her throat, feeling her life tilting in a direction she couldn't yet see. She had no idea that this man knew her better than she could imagine. She had no idea of the debt he was repaying or the watch he'd kept for 6 long years. All she knew was that for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel alone. And that feeling was more dangerous than she could possibly know. The walk back to Cedar Ridge took them along the same road Emma had traveled that afternoon, but everything looked different in darkness. The mountains were black shapes against the star-filled sky, and the cottonwoods along the creek whispered secrets in the night breeze. Their footsteps crunched on the packed dirt road, a steady rhythm that felt almost companionable. "Tell me about your sewing," Cade said after they'd walked in silence for a while. "How did you learn?" "My mother taught me. She was the best seamstress in 3 counties, people said. She could look at someone and know their measurements just by eye. I used to watch her work, and she'd let me practice on scraps." Emma smiled at the memory. "I wasn't very good at first. My stitches were all crooked, and I'd stick myself with the needle more than I'd stick the fabric. But you kept at it. I loved it. The way something flat and shapeless could become something beautiful, something useful. And I loved sitting with my mother while she worked. She'd tell me stories, teach me things." Emma's voice grew quieter. "After she died, sewing was the only thing that made me feel close to her again." Cade nodded slowly. "That makes sense, keeping her alive through what she taught you. Did your mother teach you to carve? That spoon was so beautiful." "No, my father taught me that. He was a carpenter back in Wyoming, could make anything out of wood furniture, tools, even toys for the children in town." Cade's voice held the warmth of good memories. "He said working with wood taught you patience, that you couldn't rush it or force it. You had to understand the grain, work with it instead of against it." "Is he still?" "He died 8 years ago, my mother 6 months after. They're buried back in Wyoming." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." They walked a few more steps before Cade added, "Your father, what was he like?" "Strong, patient. He could fix anything, build anything. People said he had hands that understood wood and metal both." Emma felt the familiar ache of loss, softened now by years but never quite gone. "He was kind, too. Never raised his voice, never said an unkind word about anyone. He sounds like a good man." "He was the best man I ever knew." Emma hesitated, then asked, "Did you know him? You said earlier you'd been to Cedar Ridge over the years." There was a pause, longer than seemed natural. When Cade spoke, his voice was careful. "I met him once, briefly. He helped me with something." "Really? When?" "Long time ago, 6, 7 years back." Cade seemed to choose his words with care. "I'd taken a fall up in the mountains, hurt my shoulder pretty bad. Made it down to Cedar Ridge to see if anyone could help. Your father found me at the edge of town, barely able to sit my horse. He took me to his cabin, set my shoulder, gave me a place to rest for 2 days until I could travel again." Emma stopped walking, turning to look at Cade in the darkness. "My father did that?" "He did. Wouldn't take payment either, though I offered. Said helping people was just what you did. I never knew that. He never mentioned it." It was right before Cade stopped, and Emma understood. "Right before they got sick?" "Yes." They started walking again, but Emma's mind was racing. Her father had helped Cade, and now Cade had helped her. It felt like more than coincidence, like threads of a pattern she couldn't quite see. The lights of Cedar Ridge came into view, warm yellow squares of lamplight in windows. Most people would be in bed soon, up early for church tomorrow. The town was quiet, peaceful in the way small towns could be when nothing was happening. "My cabin's just ahead," Emma said, pointing to the small structure at the edge of town. "The one with the blue door." "I remember it," Cade said, and something in the way he said it made Emma look at him curiously. But his face revealed nothing. They reached her cabin, and Emma felt an unexpected reluctance for this evening to end. Standing here in front of her door with Cade beside her, she realized she hadn't felt this connected to another person since her parents died. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew. This man would go back to his mountains, and she'd be alone again. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" The words were out before Emma could stop them, bold and improper, and she didn't care. "It's the least I can do after you walked me all this way." Cade looked at her for a long moment, and Emma couldn't read his expression. Then he nodded. "I'd like that." Emma unlocked the door and led him inside, quickly lighting the lamp on the table. The cabin was just as she'd left it that morning, tidy, spare, with her sewing materials neatly organized along one wall. She felt suddenly self-conscious about the smallness of it, the poverty it represented. But Cade didn't seem to notice or care. He looked around with interest, taking in the quilts folded on the bed, the herbs hanging from the rafters, the small shelf of books her mother had treasured. "It's a good space," he said. "Well cared for." "It's small." "Small isn't the same as bad. Your father built this?" "Yes. He said it was meant to be a starting place, that they'd build something bigger when they could afford it." Emma moved to the stove, stirring the coals back to life. They never got the chance. She put water on to boil and reached for the coffee tin on the shelf. Her hand brushed against a small wooden box, and something made her pause. She'd been meaning to go through her father's things for years, but had never found the courage. "Emma," Cade's voice was gentle, "you all right? There's a box here. My father's things. I haven't looked at it since—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "You don't have to now." But Emma was already lifting it down, something compelling her forward. She set it on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were odds and ends, a pocket knife, some old letters, a few coins, and there, wrapped in cloth, was a pocket watch. Emma lifted it out carefully. It was silver, tarnished but still beautiful, with an engraved case. She pressed the catch and it opened, revealing the clock face. The hands were stopped at 3:47. "His watch," Emma whispered. "It stopped when he—" Her voice broke. Cade moved closer, looking at the watch with an expression Emma couldn't quite read. "May I?" Emma handed it to him, and Cade held it carefully, studying the face, the engraving on the case. His jaw tightened, and when he looked up at Emma, there was something in his eyes that looked almost like pain. "This is a good watch," he said quietly. "Well made. The kind a man passes down to his children. I was going to give it to my son, if I ever—" Emma stopped, embarrassed. I always thought—" "You should," Cade said firmly. "You should have children, Emma, a family. You'd be a good mother." The kindness in his voice made Emma's eyes burn with unshed tears. "Thank you." The water boiled, and Emma made the coffee, her hands steadying as she focused on the familiar task. They sat at her small table, steam rising from their cups, and talked. They talked about the mountains and the town, about the changing seasons and the hard winter that was coming. They talked about small things and big things, and Emma felt like she could talk to Cade forever and never run out of words. When the coffee was gone, and the night had deepened toward midnight, Cade finally stood to leave. Emma walked him to the door, reluctant to say goodbye. "Thank you," she said, "for everything today." "You're welcome." Cade hesitated, his hand on the doorframe. "Emma, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" But whatever he was going to say seemed to lodge in his throat. Finally he shook his head. "Never mind. It can wait. I'll see you tomorrow? Tomorrow, if you want. I'll be in town for a few more days, trading my pelts, getting supplies." Emma's heart lifted. "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." Cade smiled then, a real smile that transformed his weathered face. "Good. Sleep well, Emma. You too." She watched him walk away into the darkness, his tall form disappearing into shadows. Then she closed the door and leaned against it, holding the wildflower he'd given her, feeling the ghost of his hand on her shoulder. In her small cabin at the edge of town, Emma Hartford pressed the wildflower between the pages of her mother's Bible and lay down to sleep. And for the first time in 6 years, she didn't feel quite so alone. Morning came bright and clear, Sunday morning with church bells calling the faithful to service. Emma woke with a start, realizing she'd overslept. The previous night felt like a dream, the wedding, Cade's intervention, the walk home, the conversations that had stretched late into the night. She dressed quickly and was pinning her hair when she noticed something white on the floor near the door. Someone had slipped a piece of paper underneath while she slept. Emma picked it up, unfolded it, and felt her stomach drop. The writing was crude, done with a heavy hand and cheap ink. The message was short and venomous. Stay away from the mountain devil, or you'll regret it. Some things aren't meant to mix. There was no signature, nothing to indicate who had written it, but the threat was clear enough. Emma's hands shook as she read it again. Someone in town had been angry enough, disturbed enough by yesterday's events to write this, to sneak to her cabin in darkness and push it under her door. She folded the paper and tucked it in her pocket, trying to calm her racing heart. It was probably nothing, just someone being cruel because they could be. But the words "mountain devil" stuck with her, made her wonder what people really thought about Cade Brennan. Church bells rang again, and Emma grabbed her shawl and hurried out. She wouldn't let anonymous threats keep her from her Sunday routine. The walk to church took her down Main Street, and Emma was immediately aware that people were staring more than usual. Conversations stopped when she passed. Women whispered behind their hands. Even Mr. Dalton, normally friendly, barely nodded as she walked by his store. News of yesterday's events had spread through town like wildfire, just as she'd known it would. At the church steps, Mrs. Whitmore stood with her usual cluster of women, Mrs. Henderson, Betty Brenner, and several others whose names Emma knew, but whose friendship she'd never earned. They fell silent as Emma approached, their eyes cold. "Miss Hartford." Mrs. Whitmore's voice could have frozen water in July. "How bold of you to show your face this morning." Emma stopped, her spine straightening. "It's Sunday, Mrs. Whitmore. I always attend church on Sunday." "Yes, well, one wonders if that's wise, given your recent behavior." Mrs. Whitmore stepped closer, lowering her voice, but not enough to prevent the other women from hearing. "Consorting with that mountain man, letting him touch you in public, walking alone with him after dark. Have you no sense of decency?" "Mr. Brennan was kind to me," Emma said, working to keep her voice steady. "He did nothing improper." "Improper?" Mrs. Henderson chimed in. "My dear girl, the whole town is talking about nothing else. You've made yourself the subject of scandal." Betty Brenner, who'd been married all of 1 year and still glowed with the self-righteousness of new respectability, added, "My husband says that Cade Brennan is dangerous, that he killed a man once, up in the mountains, and you let him walk you home." Emma felt cold. "That's just a rumor. Where there's smoke, there's fire," Mrs. Whitmore said darkly. "Mark my words, Miss Hartford, that man will bring you nothing but trouble, and when he does, don't expect this community to feel sorry for you." The church bells rang a final time, and the women swept past Emma into the church, leaving her standing on the steps alone, their words echoing in her mind. Killed a man. Dangerous. Mountain devil. Emma forced herself to walk inside, to take her usual seat in the back pew. But throughout the service, she could feel eyes on her, could sense the judgment radiating from every direction. Even Pastor Williams seemed to look at her with disappointment when their eyes met. The sermon was about temptation and the importance of maintaining proper moral standards. Emma sat through it with burning cheeks, certain everyone thought it was directed at her. After the service, she didn't linger. She hurried out before anyone could corner her with more warnings or accusations. But as she reached Main Street, she saw a crowd gathered near the general store. Cade stood in the center of it, his wagon loaded with pelts, facing down 3 men Emma recognized as ranch hands from various spreads around Cedar Ridge. They were younger than Cade, larger, and clearly looking for trouble. "We don't want your kind here," one of them was saying as Emma approached. "Why don't you take your furs and go back to whatever hole you crawled out of?" Cade's expression was calm, but Emma could see the tension in his shoulders. "I'm just here to trade, same as I do twice a year. I'm not looking for trouble." "Well, trouble's found you anyway." Another ranch hand stepped closer, emboldened by the crowd. "You think you can come down here and put your hands on our women? Think you can—" "Stop it!" Emma's voice rang out before she could think better of it. She pushed through the crowd to stand beside Cade. "Leave him alone." The ranch hands turned to her with expressions ranging from surprise to contempt. Behind them, Emma could see Sheriff Rawlings approaching, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Miss Hartford," the sheriff said, his voice carrying authority that made the crowd settle. "These men are harassing Mr. Brennan," Emma said, her voice stronger than she felt. "He's done nothing wrong." One of the ranch hands laughed. "She's defending him now. Ain't that sweet?" Sheriff Rawlings fixed the man with a hard stare. "That's enough. Cade Brennan has as much right to trade in this town as anyone. You boys have a problem with that. You can take it up with me. Otherwise, move along." The ranch hands grumbled but dispersed, shooting dark looks at both Emma and Cade as they went. The crowd began to break up, people returning to their Sunday activities but still whispering, still watching. Sheriff Rawlings approached Cade and Emma. He was a man in his 50s, weathered and fair-minded, one of the few people in town Emma had always trusted. "Cade," he said, nodding. "Miss Hartford, I'd appreciate it if you two would be a bit more careful. Folks are stirred up, and I'd rather not have trouble in my town." "We haven't done anything wrong, Sheriff," Emma said. "I know that, but sometimes it doesn't matter what's true, just what people believe." He looked at Cade. "How much longer you planning to be in town?" "Few more days. Got to get my supplies and head back before the snow comes." The sheriff nodded. "Try to keep a low profile until then. And Miss Hartford, you might want to—" He paused, seemed to reconsider. "Just be careful, both of you." He walked away, leaving Emma and Cade standing together in the street. Around them, Cedar Ridge hummed with ordinary Sunday activity, but Emma felt like she was standing in the eye of a storm. "You shouldn't have done that," Cade said quietly. "Defending me like that." "Yes, I should have. You defended me yesterday." "That's different." "How?" Cade looked at her with those pale eyes, and Emma saw worry there, and something else she couldn't name. "Because I don't care what these people think of me. But you have to live here, Emma. You have to make your living among these folks. And I'm making that harder for you." Emma pulled the threatening note from her pocket and handed it to him. "Someone already decided to make things harder for me." Cade read the note, and his jaw tightened. When he looked up, there was anger in his eyes, controlled, but burning hot beneath the surface. "Who wrote this?" "I don't know. It was under my door this morning." "Emma, I know what you're going to say. That we should stay away from each other, that this isn't worth the trouble." Emma surprised herself with the steel in her voice. "But I'm tired of living my life according to what other people think I should do. You showed me kindness when no one else would. I won't turn my back on that just because it makes people uncomfortable." Cade studied her face for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right, but if anyone threatens you again, you tell me immediately." "I will. I mean it, Emma. These notes, these warnings, they could escalate." "I understand." Emma looked around at the town she'd lived in for 6 years, seeing it differently now. "But I won't be frightened into hiding. Not anymore." Cade's expression softened, and something that might have been pride flickered in his eyes. "Your father would be proud of you. You've got his spine." The mention of her father made Emma remember the previous night, how Cade had known him, how he'd been helped by him. It felt like more than coincidence, but she couldn't quite see the shape of it yet. "Will I see you later?" she asked. "If you want to." "I do." Cade nodded, then climbed onto his wagon and drove toward the trading post. Emma watched him go, aware of eyes on her from every direction, aware that she'd just made a choice that couldn't be unmade. She walked back to her cabin with her head high, the threatening note burning in her pocket like a coal, and wondered what storm was coming. 2 days passed in a strange suspension. Emma worked in her cabin, taking in mending and finishing a dress for Mrs. Dalton, while outside the town buzzed with gossip about her and Cade. She ventured out only when necessary, and each time she did, she felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her like a physical thing. Cade came by each evening after his trading was done. They'd sit on her small porch and talk as the sun set, carefully proper but enjoying each other's company. Emma learned that he could track any animal through any terrain, that he'd once spent an entire winter snowed in at his cabin with nothing but his books and his own thoughts. Cade learned that Emma could quote poetry from memory, that she'd dreamed once of going to San Francisco to see the ocean. They were becoming friends, maybe more than friends, and that terrified and thrilled Emma in equal measure. On the third morning, Emma found another note under her door. This one was different, not threatening, but urgent. It was in Cade's handwriting, rough but legible. Need to show you something, important. Meet me at the north edge of town, at noon if you can. Please come alone. See, Emma's heart raced as she read it. Something in the careful way he'd written please told her this was serious. At noon, she walked to the north edge of town, where the road climbed toward the mountains. Cade waited there with 2 horses, one of them saddled with a woman's saddle. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Not well, but I can manage. Where are we going?" "My cabin. It's a few hours up the mountain." He saw her hesitation and added, "Emma, I need to show you something. Something I should have shown you days ago. Will you trust me?" Emma looked into his eyes and saw worry there, and honesty, and something that looked like fear. Whatever this was, it mattered to him deeply. "I trust you," she said. The ride up the mountain was beautiful and terrifying. The trail was narrow, winding through pine forests that smelled of resin and earth. They climbed higher and higher until Emma could see Cedar Ridge spread out below them like a toy town. The air grew thinner, clearer, cold enough that she was glad for her shawl. They rode in silence, Cade leading the way with the ease of someone who'd traveled this path 1,000 times. Emma focused on staying in the saddle and not looking down at the steep drops beside the trail. Finally, after what felt like hours, they emerged into a clearing. Cade's cabin sat there like it had grown from the mountain itself, small, sturdy, built of logs chinked tight against the weather. A creek ran nearby, crystal clear and singing over stones. The view stretched for miles, mountains rolling away in every direction. "It's beautiful," Emma breathed. "Come inside." Cade's voice was tight, nervous in a way she'd never heard before. The cabin's interior was spare but well kept. A bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with books and supplies. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Everything was neat, organized, the home of someone who lived carefully. Cade went to a trunk at the foot of the bed and opened it. He pulled out something wrapped in oilcloth and set it on the table with hands that weren't quite steady. "Before I show you this," he said, "I need you to understand something. Everything I've done, every choice I've made, has been with the best of intentions. I never meant to deceive you." Emma's mouth went dry. "Cade, you're scaring me." "I know. I'm sorry." He unwrapped the oilcloth, and inside was a photograph, a daguerreotype in a simple frame. Emma stepped closer and looked at it. The photograph showed 3 people standing in front of a church, a young woman in a wedding dress, beautiful and smiling. A young man beside her, his hand on her waist. Emma's father, younger but unmistakable, and standing on the other side of the bride, dressed in a suit that looked uncomfortable on him even in the photograph, was a young Cade Brennan. Emma stared at the photograph, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. "I don't understand. That's your mother and father on their wedding day," Cade said quietly. 26 years ago, I was your father's best man." The cabin seemed to tilt. Emma gripped the edge of the table. "What? I didn't just know your father, Emma. I was his best friend. We grew up together in Wyoming. When he met your mother, Cade's voice caught. "I loved her too. We both did." Emma felt like the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. "You loved my mother?" "I did. But she chose your father, and she chose right. He was the better man. I stepped aside because I wanted them to be happy." Cade turned away, his shoulders tense. I left Wyoming after their wedding, came out here, found this mountain, and built this cabin. I told myself I'd make a new life, that I'd forget. But you didn't forget. No. Your father wrote to me sometimes, letters telling me about your mother, about you when you were born. He wanted to stay friends, despite everything. Cade's laugh was bitter. He was a better man than me in every way. Emma sank into one of the chairs, her legs refusing to hold her. The time you said he helped you, when you hurt your shoulder, that was real. But it wasn't the first time I'd been to Cedar Ridge. I'd come down twice a year since you were a baby, just to see from a distance that your family was all right. Your father knew. He never said anything, but he knew. You watched us. Emma's voice was hollow. For years, yes. And when they died, I was here. I'd come down that winter, planning to trade and leave like always. But the fever came, and Cade turned back to her, and his eyes were wet. I watched your father die, Emma. I sat with him at the end, because the doctor said the fever was too contagious, that I'd already been exposed, so I might as well stay. Your mother had died the night before. You were already quarantined at Mrs. Dalton's house. Emma couldn't breathe. What did he say? He asked me to watch over you. Made me promise. He said you'd be alone and stubborn and proud, just like your mother. He said you'd need someone who understood what it meant to be alone, someone who'd let you find your own way, but be there when you needed help. Cade pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. He wrote it down. I've carried this for 6 years. Emma took the paper with shaking hands and unfolded it. Her father's handwriting, shakier than she remembered but unmistakable. Cade, if you're reading this, I'm gone. Take care of Emma. She's got her mother's heart and my stubborn streak. Don't crowd her. Don't try to replace us. Just be there. Watch over her like you watched over us all these years. She'll need someone who understands loneliness and strength both. And Cade, if the time comes when she's ready, if she can see past grief to something new, you have my blessing. You always did. You're the best man I ever knew, even if you don't believe it yourself. Make her happy, if you can. John Hartford. The letter blurred as tears filled Emma's eyes. He knew you loved her. He knew you loved me. He knew everything. Your father saw through people like they were made of glass. Cade's voice was rough. I've been watching over you for 6 years, Emma, making sure the roof on your cabin didn't leak, leaving firewood at your door before bad storms, asking Mrs. Dalton to give you extra work when money was tight. I never meant for you to know. I was going to leave again in a few days, and let that be the end of it. Then why tell me now? Because of that note you showed me. Because people are threatening you, and it's my fault for stepping in at that wedding. Cade moved closer, kneeling beside her chair. And because I can't lie to you anymore. I've watched you from a distance for 6 years. Emma, I've watched you grow strong and beautiful and independent. I've watched you survive when most people would have given up. And at that wedding, when I saw those women mocking you, I couldn't stay in the shadows anymore. Emma looked at him through her tears, seeing him completely for the first time. Not a stranger who'd been kind, not a mountain man who'd appeared by chance, but someone who'd loved her family, who'd kept a promise to her dying father, who'd protected her without asking for anything in return. Everything was a lie, she whispered. No. Cade's voice was fierce. The only lie was pretending I didn't know you. Everything else, the kindness, the respect, wanting to spend time with you, that was all real. That was all true. Emma stood abruptly, and Cade stood with her. She walked to the cabin door and looked out at the mountains, at the vast emptiness that Cade had chosen over the world. I need to think, she said. I understand. I need to. Her voice broke. I don't know what I need. Cade came to stand behind her, not touching but close enough that she could feel his presence like heat from a fire. I'm sorry, Emma. I'm sorry I didn't tell you from the start. I'm sorry I've complicated your life. I'm sorry for all of it." Emma turned to face him, and she saw in his eyes the truth of his words. She saw years of lonely watching, of keeping a promise to a dead friend, of loving from a distance, because that was all he thought he deserved. "Did you mean what you said," she asked, "about watching me grow strong and beautiful?" "Every word." "And the time we've spent together this week, was that part of your promise to my father?" "No." Cade's voice was steady now, certain. "That was for me. That was because I've spent 6 years watching you from the shadows, and when I finally had the chance to know you, to talk to you, to see the woman you've become, I couldn't help myself. That wasn't duty, Emma. That was—" He stopped, shook his head. "That was what?" "That was me falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back. Emma stared at Cade, this man who'd shaped her life without her knowing, who'd kept her safe without asking for gratitude, who'd loved her mother and then loved her. "Take me back to town," she said finally. "I need time to think about all of this." Cade nodded, and something in his face shuddered. "Of course." They rode back down the mountain in silence. The sun was setting by the time they reached Cedar Ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Cade helped Emma down from her horse, his hands careful and respectful. "Emma, don't," she said softly. "Not yet. I'll find you when I'm ready to talk." She walked to her cabin without looking back, her mind spinning with revelations, her heart a confused tangle of gratitude and anger, and something that might have been love if she could just see clearly enough to name it. Inside her cabin, Emma lit the lamp and sat at her father's old table. She pulled out the pocket watch from its box, held it in her hands, and wished more than anything that she could ask him what to do. But her father was gone, and she would have to find her own way through this, just like she'd found her way through everything else. She just wasn't sure yet which direction to walk. Emma didn't sleep that night. She sat at her table as the hours crept past, turning her father's pocket watch over and over in her hands, thinking about the photograph she'd seen, about the letter her father had written, about everything Cade had revealed. He'd loved her mother, he'd watched over her family for years, he'd kept a promise to a dying man, and now he claimed to love her too. It should have felt wrong, all of it. But as Emma watched dawn break through her window, painting her cabin in shades of gold, she realized something that surprised her. She wasn't angry. She was confused, overwhelmed, uncertain but not angry. Cade had protected her. He'd asked for nothing. And when he'd finally stepped out of the shadows at that wedding, it hadn't been to claim some reward. It had been because he couldn't bear to watch her suffer. The morning brought a knock at her door. Emma opened it to find Sarah Pritchard née Mason standing there with a basket of fresh bread and a worried expression. "Emma, I heard you went up the mountain with Cade Brennan yesterday. The whole town's talking about it. Are you all right?" Emma stood aside to let Sarah in. They'd never been close friends, but Sarah had always been kind, and right now Emma needed someone to talk to. "I'm all right," Emma said, though she wasn't sure it was true. Sarah set the basket down and looked at Emma with genuine concern. "I know it's not my place, but Emma, people are saying terrible things. Mrs. Whitmore is calling a town meeting for this evening. She says you're a danger to the community's moral fabric." "A danger?" Emma felt something hot and sharp rise in her chest. "I've done nothing wrong. I know that. So do a lot of other people. But Mrs. Whitmore has influence, and she's bent on making an example of you." Sarah hesitated, then added, "My husband's mother wants me to stay away from you, says you're not fit company anymore. And what do you think?" Sarah met Emma's eyes steadily. "I think you made my wedding dress with more care and skill than anyone else could have. I think you've always been kind and respectful. And I think if Cade Brennan chose to spend time with you, he must see something worth knowing. That man doesn't strike me as someone who'd waste his time on poor company." Emma felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected support. "Thank you. But Emma," Sarah's voice grew serious, This town meeting tonight. You need to be there. You need to defend yourself, or Mrs. Whitmore will ruin you. She's already convinced half the women in town that you're some kind of fallen woman. After Sarah left, Emma sat with the bread and thought about the evening ahead. A town meeting, a public judgment, the very thing she'd spent 6 years avoiding, being the center of attention, being scrutinized, being found wanting. She could run. She could pack her things and leave Cedar Ridge, start over somewhere else where nobody knew her story. But even as the thought formed, Emma knew she wouldn't do it. This was her home. Her parents were buried here. She'd built a life here, small as it was. And more than that, she was tired of hiding, tired of apologizing for being alone, tired of living according to other people's rules about what a proper young woman should be. Emma stood and went to the trunk at the foot of her bed. She pulled out a dress she'd made for herself 2 years ago, but had never worn too fine, she'd thought, for everyday life. Deep blue like the evening sky, with careful stitching at the collar and cuffs. She'd made it for a future version of herself, someone who had somewhere special to go. Tonight would have to count as special enough. She spent the afternoon preparing, not just her appearance but her words. What would she say when faced with Mrs. Whitmore's accusations? How could she explain Cade without revealing the truth about his connection to her father? That was his story to tell, not hers. As the sun began to set, Emma heard another knock. She opened the door to find Cade standing there, his hat in his hands. "I heard about the meeting," he said without preamble. "I'm coming with you. You'll just make it worse. I don't care. They want to judge you for spending time with me? Then I should be there to face it too." Emma stepped outside and closed the door behind her. "Cade, there's something I need to know, and I need you to tell me the truth. Always. The other night, you said you were falling in love with me. Did you mean that, or was it just too?" She struggled for words. "Was it just because of my mother? Because I remind you of her?" Cade looked at her with those pale eyes, and Emma saw pain there, and honesty. "You look like her. You have her voice, her way of tilting your head when you're thinking. The first time I saw you after your parents died, you were 16 and standing in the general store, and for a moment my heart stopped because it was like seeing her again." Emma's heart sank, but Cade wasn't finished. "But that's where the resemblance ends, Emma. Your mother was gentle and soft-spoken, happy to let others lead. You're different. You're stronger than she was, more independent. You've survived things that would have broken her. These 6 years, watching you, I wasn't seeing her ghost. I was seeing someone completely new, someone remarkable." He took a breath. "I loved your mother when I was young and didn't know better. I love you because I'm old enough now to recognize something rare when I see it." Emma felt something crack open in her chest. "Why didn't you just tell me from the start? Why all the secrecy?" "Because I'm a coward. Because I thought if you knew I'd been watching you, protecting you, you'd think I was strange or dangerous or obsessed. I thought," he shook his head, "I thought it was better to be a stranger who was kind than a friend who'd been keeping secrets. You were wrong. I know. But I can't take it back now. All I can do is stand beside you tonight and make sure everyone knows that you've done nothing wrong. That if there's anyone to blame, it's me." Emma looked at this man who'd shaped her life from the shadows, who'd loved 2 generations of Hartford women, who'd kept a promise for 6 years without asking for thanks, and she made a decision. "All right," she said, "we'll face them together. But Cade, after tonight, we need to talk. Really talk about what happens next. Whatever you want." They walked to the church together as evening settled over Cedar Ridge. The church was the largest building in town, the only one big enough to hold a full town meeting. Already Emma could see people gathering, drawn by gossip and the promise of drama. Mrs. Whitmore stood on the church steps like a sentinel, her face carved from stone. When she saw Emma and Cade approaching together, her mouth thinned to a hard line. "So, you've come to answer for yourself," she said to Emma, ignoring Cade entirely. "I've come because this is my town too. Emma replied, her voice steady. And I've done nothing that requires answering for. We'll let the community decide that. Inside, the church was packed. People filled the pews and lined the walls. Emma saw familiar faces: Mrs. Dalton, the Hendersons, the Pritchards, Sheriff Rawlings. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with judgment, most with simple curiosity. Mrs. Whitmore took her place at the front and called the meeting to order. We're gathered here tonight to address a matter of moral concern. Miss Emma Hartford has been seen consorting with Cade Brennan in ways that are unseemly for an unmarried woman. She's brought scandal to our town and set a poor example for our young people. Emma felt Cade tense beside her, but she touched his arm gently. Let Mrs. Whitmore speak. Her turn would come. I've witnessed Miss Hartford allowing this man to touch her publicly, to escort her without proper chaperone, to take her alone into the mountains, behavior that would have been unthinkable even 10 years ago. We must ask ourselves, what kind of community are we if we allow such things? Mrs. Henderson stood. I agree with Mrs. Whitmore. There are standards we must uphold. But then another voice spoke up. Mr. Dalton, the general store owner. With respect, Mrs. Whitmore, what exactly has Miss Hartford done that's so terrible? She went to a wedding and met a man. They've spent time talking. Is that really so scandalous? She went alone into the mountains with him. Mrs. Whitmore's voice rose. Without chaperone, without propriety. Maybe we should ask her what happened, came a new voice. It was Sarah Pritchard, standing now with her husband beside her. Instead of assuming the worst, maybe we should hear her side. Mrs. Whitmore looked like she'd bitten into something sour. Very well. Miss Hartford, would you care to defend yourself? Emma stood, her heart pounding but her voice steady. I don't think I need to defend myself, Mrs. Whitmore, but I'll tell you what happened, if you'd like to hear the truth, instead of gossip. She walked to the front of the church, feeling every eye on her. Cade remained seated, but she could feel his support like a hand on her back. 6 years ago, my parents died and left me alone. I was 16 years old with nothing but a cabin and a sewing needle. This town took me in, gave me work, helped me survive. For that, I'm grateful. Emma looked around at the faces watching her, but I've also been lonely. I've been on the outside looking in, watching everyone else have families and friends and love, while I just existed. That's no excuse for impropriety, Mrs. Whitmore interjected. I'm not making excuses. I'm telling you what it's like to be alone in a town full of people who see you but don't know you. Emma's voice grew stronger. When Cade Brennan offered to stand with me at that wedding, it was the first time in 6 years that someone treated me like I mattered, like I was worthy of kindness. He didn't ask anything of me. He didn't expect anything. He just helped. And then you went alone with him to his cabin, Mrs. Whitmore pressed. Do you deny it? I don't deny it. He had something to show me, something important about my father. That caused a stir. People leaned forward, suddenly more interested. Cade stood then, his tall frame drawing every eye. If I may speak, Mrs. Whitmore looked like she wanted to refuse, but Sheriff Rawlings nodded. Let him talk. Cade walked to stand beside Emma, and she felt grateful for his solid presence. Most of you don't know me, he began, his rough voice carrying through the church. You know I live in the mountains, that I trade pelts twice a year, that I keep to myself. What you don't know is why. He pulled the photograph from his pocket and held it up. This is John and Margaret Hartford on their wedding day, 26 years ago. I was John Hartford's best man. I was his best friend since childhood. And after his wedding, I came to these mountains because, he paused, choosing words carefully, because I needed to start over. But John never forgot me. He wrote to me about his life, about his daughter, and when he was dying 6 years ago, he asked me to watch over Emma. The church was silent now, everyone listening. I've kept that promise, Cade continued. I've watched over her from a distance, made sure she was safe, made sure she had what she needed. I never intended to make myself known. But at that wedding, when I saw people mocking her, I couldn't stay hidden anymore. I stepped in because her father asked me to protect her, and because—" he looked at Emma, and his voice softened, "and because she deserves better than to stand alone." Emma felt tears on her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. "So if you want to judge someone," Cade said, turning back to the crowd, "judge me. I'm the one who's been watching from the shadows. I'm the one who kept secrets. Emma did nothing wrong. She just had the courage to accept kindness when it was offered." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Sheriff Rawlings stood. "I got something to say." The sheriff looked around at the gathered townspeople. "Some of you might remember 6 years back, during that terrible fever winter, a lot of people died, including John and Margaret Hartford. What you might not know is that Cade Brennan was here then. He sat with John Hartford through his final hours when the rest of us were too scared of catching the fever ourselves. He did that for a friend, asking nothing in return. Another person stood Sam Pritchard, the blacksmith. And I can tell you that Cade Brennan is an honest man. He's traded with me for 12 years, and he's never once tried to cheat me or cause trouble. He pays fair and keeps his word." Then, to Emma's surprise, Sarah Pritchard stood again. "I have something to say too." She was shaking slightly, but her voice was clear. 2 years ago, my younger brother got lost in the mountains while hunting. We searched for 3 days and couldn't find him. Then Cade Brennan came down and said he'd heard us calling, had found Samuel, and brought him to his cabin to warm up. He saved my brother's life. "Why didn't you say anything?" Mrs. Whitmore demanded. "Because my father was ashamed that Samuel had gone so far into the mountains, ashamed that we'd needed help." Sarah looked at her father-in-law, who nodded slowly. "But it's time to tell the truth. Cade Brennan is a good man, and Emma Hartford is a good woman, and I'm tired of pretending that kindness is something to be ashamed of." Emma watched in wonder as person after person stood to share stories. The widow Thompson, whose firewood had mysteriously appeared before storms. The Peters family, whose lost cattle had been found and herded home. Small acts of kindness that people had never questioned, never connected. Mrs. Whitmore's face grew redder and tighter with each testimony. Finally she burst out, "This is ridiculous. We're not here to canonize a mountain man. We're here to discuss Miss Hartford's moral failings." "Moral failings?" Emma found her voice again, and it came out stronger than she expected. "You want to talk about moral failings, Mrs. Whitmore? Then let's talk about them." She pulled the threatening note from her pocket and held it up. "Someone left this under my door, threatening me, calling Cade a devil, trying to frighten me into what? Into being alone again? Into apologizing for being happy?" Mrs. Whitmore's face went pale. "It was you, wasn't it?" Emma said, watching the older woman's expression. "You wrote this note. I was trying to protect you." "Protect me from what? From kindness? From companionship?" Emma shook her head. "Or were you trying to protect yourself from being reminded that some people find happiness even when they're alone?" The church was silent. Mrs. Whitmore stood frozen, her mouth working but no words coming out. "Your daughter left town 5 years ago," Emma said more gently. "She ran off with that traveling salesman, and people talked about her the way they're talking about me now. That must have hurt. I'm sorry for that. But taking your pain out on me won't bring her back." Mrs. Whitmore's face crumpled. She sank back into her pew, and Emma saw not a cruel woman but a broken one. The meeting didn't last much longer after that. People filed out slowly, many stopping to speak to Emma or Cade, to offer apologies or support. By the time the church emptied, Emma felt drained, but somehow lighter. Cade waited by the door. "That was brave," he said. "It was necessary." Emma looked up at him. "You said we'd talk after this. I think it's time. All right? Where? Your cabin. I want to see it again, now that I know the truth." I want to see where you've lived all these years." Cade nodded slowly. "Tomorrow morning?" "I'll bring horses." "Tomorrow morning," Emma agreed. She walked back to her cabin alone, but for the first time in 6 years, being alone didn't feel lonely. It felt like the space before something new, like the pause between one chapter ending and another beginning. Emma lay down in her bed and thought about her father's letter, about his blessing, about the man who'd loved 2 Hartford women across 26 years, and she thought about what she would say tomorrow, when she and Cade finally talked about what came next. The man tied to the horse was young, maybe 25, with blood on his face and clothes torn from hard travel. Emma didn't recognize him at first, but Cade went very still beside her. Sheriff Rawlings dismounted, his face grave. "Cade! Miss Hartford, we need your help." "What happened?" Cade asked, already moving toward the injured man. "Raiders. A gang of them came through Cedar Ridge early this morning looking for someone." The sheriff gestured to the injured man. "This is Daniel Cooper. He was traveling through when the raiders caught up with him. Said he stole something from them, though he claims he didn't. They shot at him, chased him into the mountains." Cade was already cutting the ropes, binding Daniel, catching him as he slumped forward. Emma hurried to help, and together they got the young man into the cabin and onto Cade's bed. "How bad is it?" Emma asked, seeing the blood soaking through Daniel's shirt. "Bullet grazed his side. He's lost blood, but it's not fatal if we can stop the bleeding." Cade looked at the sheriff. "Where are these raiders now?" "Still in town. 5 of them, heavily armed. They're tearing through buildings looking for Cooper here, threatening anyone who gets in their way." Rawlings's jaw was tight. "I rode up here because you know these mountains better than anyone, Cade. We need to figure out how to get Cooper somewhere safe and deal with these men before someone gets killed." Emma was already boiling water, tearing clean cloth for bandages. She'd helped her father tend injuries before this was worse than most, but she could manage. "Why come here?" Cade asked, helping Emma clean the wound. "Why not take him to Doc Morrison?" "Because the raiders are watching the doctor's place. They're watching everywhere." Rawlings removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "And because, after last night, after what people said about you, Cade, folks in town trust you now. They know you can handle trouble." Daniel Cooper stirred, his eyes opening. "I didn't steal nothing," he mumbled. "Found it. In the old mine, outside of Butte. Found it fair and square." "Found what?" Emma asked gently, pressing cloth to his wound. "Gold. Small nugget, but pure. Worth maybe $50. Daniel's voice was weak, but urgent. "These men, they claim that mine is theirs, that anything found there belongs to them. But that mine's been abandoned for 3 years. I got papers to prove it." Cade exchanged glances with the sheriff. "They followed him all the way from Butte, over a $50 nugget?" "It's not about the gold," Rawlings said grimly. "It's about making an example. These are the same men who've been terrorizing mining camps up north. They take what they want and kill anyone who stands up to them." Emma felt ice in her stomach. "They're in town right now? With all those people? That's why I need your help, Cade." The sheriff looked at the other men he'd brought, local ranchers and farmers. Good men, but not fighters. "We're outgunned and outmatched. But you were in the army. You know tactics." Cade's expression went carefully neutral. "That was a long time ago. 20 years, I heard. Fought in the Indian Wars. Served with distinction before you mustered out." Rawlings leaned forward. "Cade, I know you came up here to leave that life behind. But right now, Cedar Ridge needs someone who knows how to handle dangerous men." Emma watched Cade's face, saw the struggle there. This was why he'd come to the mountains, she realized. To get away from violence, from war, from being the man who knew how to kill. "Please," she said softly. "Those people in town, they're my neighbors. My friends. Sarah Pritchard, the Daltons. All of them." Cade looked at her, and something in his expression softened. "All right. But we do this smart, not bloody. The goal is to get those men to leave without anyone dying. How? One of the ranchers asked. Cade stood, moving to the window to look down at the valley below. Emma could almost see his mind working, tactical and strategic, the soldier he'd been emerging from beneath the mountain man he'd become. They're looking for Cooper, and they think he's in town, so we give them Cooper, or at least we make them think we have. Cade turned back to the group. We need to draw them out of Cedar Ridge, away from people, up into the mountains where they can't hurt anyone. How do we do that? Rawlings asked. We send a message that Cooper's here, at my cabin, that I'm protecting him. Cade's voice was steady. They'll come. Men like that, they can't resist a challenge. That's suicide, one of the ranchers protested. 5 armed men against what? You and whoever stays with you? Not if we're smart about it. Cade pulled a piece of paper toward him and began sketching. This cabin sits in a natural choke point, 1 trail up, steep drops on either side. They'll have to come at a single file, or risk the horses. We'll have the high ground, cover, and we'll know the terrain. Emma watched him work, saw the transformation. This was the man her father had known, not just a friend, but a soldier. Someone who'd seen violence and learned how to control it. I'm staying, Emma said suddenly. Emma, no, Cade began. I'm staying, she repeated firmly. You'll need someone to tend Daniel if shooting starts, and I'm a good shot with a rifle. My father taught me. Cade looked like he wanted to argue, but Sheriff Rawlings nodded. She's right, and it might help knowing we've got a woman up here who needs protecting. Makes us look less like we're planning an ambush. This is dangerous, Cade said to Emma, his voice low and urgent. I know, but I'm not leaving you to face this alone. Emma met his eyes steadily. You spent 6 years protecting me from the shadows. Now let me stand beside you in the light. Cade held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but you stay inside with Cooper. No matter what happens, you don't come out until it's over. Agreed. The sheriff and his men began preparing, checking weapons and ammunition. Cade positioned them strategically, 2 men in the rocks above the trail, 2 more in the trees flanking the cabin approach. He gave calm, clear orders, and the men followed without question. As afternoon sun slanted through the trees, Cade came back inside where Emma sat beside Daniel Cooper. The young man was sleeping now, his breathing steady but weak. They'll be here soon, Cade said. I sent word to town that Cooper's at my cabin. Will this work? Emma asked. It has to. Cade knelt beside her, taking her hand. Emma, if something goes wrong, nothing will go wrong. But if it does, you need to know that these last few days with you have been the best of my life. That loving you has made me remember what it means to be human, not just a man hiding from his past. Emma squeezed his hand. Then we'll make sure you survive to have more days like these, and Cade, I love you too. I think I've loved you since that night at the wedding, even though I didn't understand it then. They heard horses then, distant but approaching. Cade stood, checking his rifle one last time. Stay inside, he reminded her. No matter what. Be careful. Cade smiled, brief and warm. Always am. He stepped outside, and Emma heard him call out to the sheriff and the hidden men, coordinating final positions. Through the window, she could see the trail below, could see dust rising as riders approached. 5 men, just as the sheriff had said. Hard-looking men with guns and hostile intent. The confrontation that would define everything was about to begin. Emma checked Daniel's wound, made sure he was as comfortable as possible, then picked up her father's old rifle from where Cade had left it. She might have promised to stay inside, but that didn't mean she'd be helpless. Outside, she heard Cade's voice carry across the clearing. That's far enough. State your business. And the leader of the raiders replied with words that chilled Emma's blood. We're here for Cooper, and anyone who stands in our way dies. The battle for Cedar Ridge and for Emma and Cade's future was about to unfold. The standoff lasted 3 hours, though to Emma it felt like 3 days. She watched through the cabin window as Cade negotiated with the raiders' leader, a scarred man named Garrett, who seemed to enjoy the threat of violence more than violence itself. Cade never raised his voice, never showed fear. He stood in the clearing with his rifle held casually but ready, speaking with the calm authority of someone who'd faced worse than 5 men with guns. "Cooper's under my protection," Cade said, "and this is private land. You're trespassing." "Don't care about your land or your protection," Garrett shot back. "That boy stole from us, and we mean to have justice. He found abandoned gold in an abandoned mine. That's not stealing. It is when we say it is." The conversation went in circles, but Emma noticed something. Each time it circled, Garrett grew more frustrated, more agitated, and each time Cade remained absolutely calm. He was wearing them down, she realized, making them lose patience, make mistakes. Sheriff Rawlings had positioned his men well. The raiders didn't know they were being watched from above and behind, didn't realize the trap Cade had drawn them into. They thought they had the advantage of numbers. Finally, Garrett made his move. He spurred his horse forward, reaching for his gun. Cade fired first, not at Garrett, but at the ground in front of his horse. The animal reared, throwing Garrett backward. In the same instant, Sheriff Rawlings and his men revealed themselves, rifles aimed. "Drop your weapons," Rawlings called out. "You're surrounded." For a tense moment, Emma thought the raiders might fight. But Garrett, sprawled on the ground with 5 rifles pointed at him, slowly raised his hands. One by one, his men did the same. It was over without a single death, without even a single injury, beyond Garrett's bruised pride. As the sheriff and his men disarmed and bound the raiders, Cade came back to the cabin. Emma met him at the door, and without thinking she threw her arms around him. "You did it," she whispered against his chest. "You kept everyone safe." "We did it." Cade held her tight. "Together." The ride back to Cedar Ridge was slow, accommodating both the prisoners and Daniel Cooper, who was conscious now and grateful. As they descended into the valley, Emma could see people gathering in the street, word of the confrontation having already spread. They rode into town not as outcasts, but as heroes. Sarah Pritchard was the first to approach, tears in her eyes as she thanked Cade for protecting the town. Others followed Mr. Dalton, the Hendersons, even some of the women who'd stood with Mrs. Whitmore at the church meeting. Mrs. Whitmore herself stood on the church steps, and when Emma met her eyes, the older woman nodded slowly. Not quite forgiveness, but acknowledgement. A start. The raiders were locked in the sheriff's small jail to await trial, and Daniel Cooper was taken to Doc Morrison's house to recover properly. As evening settled over Cedar Ridge, Emma and Cade found themselves standing together in the street, exhausted and relieved. "Come to my cabin," Emma said. "I'll make coffee." "I'd like that." They walked together through town, and this time no one whispered. People called out greetings, thanks, well wishes. Emma felt the shift from outsider to member of the community, from scandalous to celebrated. Inside her cabin, Emma made coffee, while Cade sat at her father's table. The same table where they'd talked that first night, where Emma had shown him the pocket watch, where so much had changed. "What happens now?" Emma asked, setting the coffee between them. "You'll need to go back to your cabin before winter comes." "I've been thinking about that." Cade wrapped his hands around the cup, looking at Emma with those pale eyes that no longer seemed cold. "These past few days being part of things again, helping people, being with you. I don't want to go back to being alone." Emma's heart stuttered. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe it's time I came down from that mountain for good. Maybe it's time I stopped hiding from life." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "If you'll have me, Emma, if you think you could build a life with someone like me." Emma looked at their joined hands, at the ring on her finger, at the face of the man who'd loved her family across decades. "I think we've already started building it." "Then I'm asking, will you marry me? Not because your father wanted me to watch over you, not because I loved your mother once, but because I love you, Emma Hartford, and I want to spend whatever years I have left making you happy." Emma felt tears on her cheeks, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." Cade stood and pulled her into his arms, and they held each other in the small cabin where Emma had been so lonely for so long. But she wasn't lonely anymore. She would never be lonely again. 3 months later, on a cold December morning, Emma Hartford married Cade Brennan in the same church where the town meeting had been held. Sarah Pritchard stood as her witness, and Sheriff Rawlings stood for Cade. The church was full, it seemed. The whole town had come to celebrate. Mrs. Whitmore was there, sitting in the back, and when Emma caught her eye, the older woman smiled. Small, tentative, but real. After the ceremony, as Emma and Cade walked out into the winter sunlight, Emma thought about the journey that had brought them here. A wedding where she'd stood alone, a mountain man's simple kindness, secrets revealed and forgiveness earned, a town's judgment transformed into acceptance. They would split their time, she and Cade. Winters in town where Emma could continue her sewing and they could be part of the community. Summers in the mountain cabin where the air was clear and the world was vast. The best of both worlds, together. As they stood on the church steps, Cade pulled something from his pocket, a small wooden figure carved during the long evenings of their courtship. It was a woman with a needle in her hand, seated at a sewing table. "For you," he said, "so you always remember who you are, even when you're being my wife." Emma took the carving, feeling the smooth wood, seeing the love in every detail. "Thank you. For this, for everything. For waiting, for protecting me, for loving me. It was never a burden, Emma. It was always a gift." They walked to Emma's cabin, their cabin now hand in hand through the snow. Inside, Cade built up the fire while Emma made coffee, and they sat together at the old table, talking and laughing and planning their future. On the shelf above the bed, Emma had arranged her treasures, her mother's cameo brooch, the pressed wildflower from that first night, the wooden spoon Cade had carved, the daguerreotype of her parents' wedding, her father's pocket watch now repaired and running, keeping perfect time. And in the spring, when the snow melted and the trail to the mountain opened again, Cade would begin building a rocking chair. It would take him all summer, carved with care and love, a place for Emma to sit on the cabin porch and watch the sunset over the mountains they both loved. But that was still to come. For now, in the small cabin at the edge of Cedar Ridge, two people who'd been lonely for different reasons sat together and discovered that sometimes the kindness of a stranger is just fate's way of bringing you home. The girl who'd attended a wedding alone had found something she'd never expected, not just love, but belonging, not just a companion, but a partner who understood both solitude and connection. And in a town that had once judged her, Emma Hartford Brennan, seamstress, survivor, and now wife to the mountain man everyone had feared, finally found her place. Not on the outside looking in, but right in the center, where she'd belonged all along.